Welcome to Talking Points, the show that explores areas of vital interest to the state of Oregon. I'm your host, Angie Christensen. Today we're visiting with Dave and Carrie Dotterrer. Dave is a candidate for Oregon State Senate, District Number 3. Welcome, Dave and Carrie.
Oh, thank
you
for having us.
Nice to have you both today, have you back again.
Yeah.
So Carrie, let's talk with you just for a minute or two. I understand that you and Dave have traveled the world, traveled the United States, lived here and there, and throughout all of this, you've had 2 children to raise. How did that go, and what are they doing today?
Well, the kids had a really wonderful experience being military kids, and Stephanie, our eldest, is a teacher up in Beaverton. She's been married for a year and just really loving her job up there. Our son Charles is a first lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps, and he just returned safely from Afghanistan in late May and has recently moved his family from Hawaii to Virginia, and so we got to see our 2 little grandkids. So
I bet you're so proud of them.
We are.
You've done such a good job. That's great. Well, let's shift our attention now to Dave. Dave, tell us just a little bit about yourself so we can get to know you.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Oregon, and Eugene specifically, and went off to Oregon State. And while I was there, I decided I was going to join the Marine Corps, and I went into the Marine Corps in the early 70s and spent almost 30 years, retired as a colonel. Okay. And during that time, I picked up a couple of master's degrees, one in history and the other one in national security planning and strategy. And those are, before I retired, I spent some time as the military assistant to the Secretary of the Navy. Okay. So I worked at those higher levels of the government, and I also worked in the areas of strategic planning. So I feel very, very comfortable in the areas of strategic planning, requirements, responsibilities, and how you match resources to those. And so that's just a very a brief background in what I did in my professional life.
That's outstanding. So with that in mind then, what made you go into politics, and especially into the Oregon State Senate race?
Well, you know, it was, first off, this is the first time I've ever run for a political office. And it just became clear to me over the last few years that in the state of Oregon, the leadership and the direction that this state is going in is just wrong. And I felt that we weren't addressing the issues that are important to Oregonians. Okay. Specifically, first off, is the jobs. When I think about jobs, I'm thinking about the fact that what we really need are private sector jobs, not government jobs, and that it's the private sector's responsibility, and that the private sector should be producing these jobs. So we need a robust economy. And then finally, the fiscal problems we're having in this state right now, the spending problems. And those are the issues that really need to be addressed. And it just was clear to me that the problems we face today are not going to be solved by the people who caused them. And we're going to need this new leadership and this new direction. And that's why I decided that I'd step forward and run for office.
Okay. Well, now I noticed that you're running on both the Republican and the independent ticket. I don't think too many candidates do that. Why are you doing that?
Well, it's interesting. Oregon is one of those, as I understand, the only state that you can actually do that you can run on 2 parties' tickets. And I think that it's important because, first off, I consider myself an independent thinking guy. Okay. And I'm not wed to party politics. And I also think that anybody who has ever worked with me, I'm on the Ashland Planning Commission, for example, anybody who's ever worked with me on a committee or a commission knows that I like to work in a bipartisan way. And I think it's very important that as a group you get along. So, and I believe that I have a philosophy of government. I don't have an ideology. Okay. And that's important because there's too many people that have the ideologies. And the other reason that I believe it's important to be part of the independent party and be the independent party candidate is because 25% of this district are independent or non-affiliated voters. And they're not affiliated with one of the major political parties. And that's the way they're thinking, and so to me that's an important endorsement, if you will, to have from the independent party.
I agree. Dave, the state economists have recently come out with yet another reduction in projections of state income, which will further require further reductions in the current biennial budget. What is your take on this whole budget mess that we're in the middle of?
Well, it's interesting that you use the term mess instead of crisis, because we often hear the word crisis, but typically, and the way I define a crisis, and typically the way it's defined, is a crisis is something that was unforeseen and is typically not something that you've done to yourself. And I believe that the fiscal mess we're in right now should have been anticipated. People should have seen it coming. The current leadership in Salem should have seen this coming. And I believe we did it to ourselves. I mean, this is, there are different things that are beyond our control, but we should have been able to anticipate this coming. And I think it's happened because of bad budget planning, or a bad budget process. You know, we find ourselves, unfortunately, I believe right now in a reactive mode. See, because we didn't have a contingency plan, because we didn't have as many contingency funds as we actually needed, because we hadn't established priorities, now we find ourselves reacting to this situation. Right. And way back in 2009, in the depth of the recession, we should have anticipated that that the economy there's a very good chance, and you have to play the odds, but there's a very good chance that the economy was not going to come back the way we expected it to, but that's not the way the budget was written. It was assumed that certain things were going to happen, and there were no contingencies built into that. And so we had minimal reserves, for example, and we also then, if you look at it, we had excessive borrowing. And what the problem with that borrowing is when you borrow money, that's the first thing that you have to pay back, because that's contractual. Right. And now you find yourself, you have to pay off the borrowing. You can't cut back there, so now you have to take from other accounts, and that just wasn't the right way to do things. So we were just making promises that we just couldn't keep, and again, that's why we find ourselves in this mess. And it's not, at the end of the day, it's not about the revenue, in the sense that the revenue, it's not a revenue problem with our budget. Our problem is spending, and how much we've increased spending over the last few years.
Okay. Now the legislature meets, now correct me if I'm wrong, it's 6 months out of 2 years? So they're not meeting now?
No.
No. So do you think that they should be called into an emergency session to deal with the mess that we're in?
Yeah, yes, I do. And the reason I say that is because the budget, you've seen about almost $1.5 billion in revenue reduction, if you will, or a less revenue than what was anticipated. It's a huge problem. And the governor has limited options in what he can do. And because you didn't come up with these contingency plans, and because they weren't in place, and we now find ourselves reactive, it's time for the legislature to come back in and do what its job is to determine for the people of Oregon what our spending priorities are, and looking at the money that needs to be spent. And what happens way too often, or far too often, I should say, in our budgeting processes is when we end up with a shortfall, we start cutting from the bottom, and we start looking for places that we can cut here, we can cut there, and all. And what that does is that's really upside down. The question is, well, what's important to you? So it isn't a matter of what are you going to cut, it's a matter of what are you going to keep. And you need to, and if you haven't established a contingency plan, if you haven't established priorities, if you haven't done as much planning as you should, then you're going to find yourself going to what for most people is their comfort zone, which is, well, let's go find that account, cut a certain amount of money. So I think it's important then that the legislature step in at this point and fulfill its responsibilities, because they should be setting the priorities and on what our spending should be.
Right, they need to come back and deal with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So Dave, then how do you intend to accomplish the budget process reform?
Well, I see that on the budget reform process that we need to go back and look at is, I see 3 legs to it. Okay. The first leg is that the process needs to start with, some people refer to it as zero-based budgeting. That's not the way exactly I look at it, but I look at it as a legislature, in a bipartisan way, you sit down and you decide Why is it we have state government? What are the clear responsibilities of that state government? And what are the requirements that we need to meet? And then sit down and establish priorities. And once you've established those priorities, then and only then do you go and look at, well, how many resources do we have? You start applying those resources, and at a certain point, you're going to have to say no. It isn't a matter of just saying, well, I'll take a little bit money from this account, and I won't give these people this agency, or I won't give this program as much. You're going to have to go in there and say no. These other issues or these other programs are more important, and we just can't fund all of these. We can't be everything to everybody.
Right.
And
as much as we'd like to.
even if you look at the governor's recent task force, he said we've got to do this a different way, and it needs to be done. So that's the first leg. The second leg of this reforming the budget process is one of the problems that's very, very clear to me when you look at the budget is that the legislature, because they have this requirement to balance the budget, they look at the current or the upcoming budget, they look at it in 2-year snapshots. It's a biennial budget.
Okay.
And so they look at it and they say, okay, well, we've balanced this budget. And far too often, they're making decisions that have budgetary implications out 2 and 3 and 4 budgets out. And we need to do multi-budget budgeting.
Right, right.
Multi-year budgeting. Because you need to look at that. And that's the way I've seen budgeting done in the past. And it works. Because you understand that if I make a certain budget decision this year, what are the implications 3, 4, 5 years in the future?
Right.
And there's not enough of that. And third leg then is it's clear, and I think all Oregonians understand this, that we've got to have some kind of a contingency fund
right.
and some kind of a rainy day fund. Call it what you will. Mm-hmm. There are lots of, or several, I should say, proposals on the table looking at how you would go about that. And I'm open to any of them. Let's put them all on the table. There's several of them that are great ideas. We just know that every 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a business downturn. We're going to see an economic downturn. It happens.
It just happens.
And happens on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And we just need to make sure, like most people, you maintain a contingency fund. You maintain a reserve. You know, most of us do that with our home budgets, and there's no reason why the state can't do that. And I think that the people of Oregon, we can come to a consensus on what this would look like. And again, like I say, there's a lot of good ideas out there.
Right. Well, I think it's good that you're willing to have everything on the table, look at everything, and that's a good way of brainstorming and taking the best of this and the best of that, and that's really working with everybody.
Well, that's interestingly, that's the way I learned to do strategic planning. Is that the first thing you do is you don't start looking for what you believe to be the optimum solution. What you do is you look at all the possible options, you put them on the table, and you don't reject anything unless it's so far out in left or right field that it isn't going to work. But I mean, but you don't reject any idea. You put them on the table, and my sense is that the legislature doesn't do that as much as it should, and it needs to spend some time just looking at what those options are, then analyze them.
Right.
And what you'll find is you might pick one, but you're also going to pull different ideas, just like you said, from the other options, and that works out very nicely. And that's what we need to do.
It's a very healthy approach.
Yeah.
It's very good.